Greetings, my name is Maria Bloyer, and you are at the IDEA Advocacy Project with Boston University and Advocates for Justice and Education. Today's conversation is impacting special education policy, making your voice heard. Today's agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to do some quick introductions, get through the first session, and some administrative work at the beginning. We'll be talking about special education policy on the federal level and the upcoming reauthorization. And then on Wednesday evening, when we all reconvene, we will practice some of what we talked about today, work on our pitch to legislators and policymakers, and we'll get some of those recorded on Wednesday evening. So thank you for being here again, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone again on Wednesday evening. Okay. If you haven't had a chance to do this already, this is the survey from our partners at Boston University. This is part of a broader research project. So if you are able to do it, we would really appreciate it if you could take this survey. It does help in the research and also in supporting the work that groups like AJE and others are doing to make sure that parents have voice in the policy decision-making world. Okay. This is the AJE registration link. If you were forwarded this video from a friend or a colleague, this is a great place to make sure that you're connected to us and that we have your information so we can connect with you on Wednesday evening. So if you haven't done these two forms, take a moment to do them now. If you have any problems with them, please let us know. All right, so introductions, we've already talked a little bit about me. My name's Maria Bloyer. I'm at Advocates for Justice and Education, or AJE. We are the district's federally designated training and information center. You're going to be meeting some folks on Wednesday evening from Boston University, and I'll let them talk then about themselves. Okay. All right. The research project associated with the study, again, that's why there's two surveys today. And there's really three parts. There's this conversation and the conversation we'll have on Wednesday that will be live. There's the pre and post survey, and then there's the 6-month follow-up survey. Please know that participation in the research does not affect your ability to participate in this training. And please know that everything is kept confidential. I think it's important to participate in research to make sure the family voice is elevated and heard. But again, you do not have to. And you are more than welcome to participate in the training without having done the surveys. Okay, so today, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about the federal law and what are some places we might want to see changes and what might those changes be. Okay, and then on Wednesday, we're going to be reconvening and we're going to talk about some communication tools, and we can do some practice. And then at the end of Wednesday evening, we'll do some short video recording, and you'll have that as an advocacy tool in your arsenal. Okay. All right. So the goal of this conversation is really to give you specific language and a strategy for when you're talking to legislators so that you can ask for very specific changes to IDEA, which again is a federal law. We're really only talking about the federal law and the federal regulations here. I will always, of course, point out the local DC distinctions. But this is really very much focused on the IDEA reauthorization. There are really two kinds of slides in today's conversation. There are white slides, which is about what the law is right now. And then the blue slides are kind of thinking slides to give you a chance to think about what you might want changed in IDEA and what you think might need to be different. Okay. So the big goals for today, again, I want you to get familiar with this framework and start thinking about what changes you might want to see. Okay, of course, you're going to be welcome to ask questions at the live session on Wednesday, but we have a rule. And that rule is that we're only accepting questions in this format. And we'll practice it and go over it together. But it's called the hook, line, sinker approach. Okay, hook, line, sinker. And really, this is a great way to condense your story and explain the reason for your ask. So introduce yourself. Hi, my name is Maria. And then put a little hook with there, which is why the person might want to listen to you. Okay, that could be your connection to the issue, the fact that you're a constituent of theirs, your personal lived experience. Okay, the line, here's your concern or problem in special education, what you're worried about. This is where you put your story, but again, it's a very short, condensed version of your story. Okay, and then this is your sinker. This is your ask. Okay, here's your question and what you want changed. Here's your question and or what you want changed in IDEA. Like I said, we'll practice this on Wednesday, but I just want you to get a sense of it right now. And here is a great example. So hi, my name is Maria Bloyer. I'm a attorney, and when I was in school, I was a student with an IEP for many, many years. I have a lot of concerns about how special education functions. And one of the things I'm most worried about is the low expectations and challenges that students with disabilities have accessing grade level curriculum, including, work that's above grade level. And I would like in IDEA, when it is reauthorized, for there to be specific language requiring that school districts work towards bringing students to grade level or above if needed. Yeah. So there you go, hook, line, sinker. Okay, and your hook isn't going to be the same every time. Your line isn't going to be the same every time. And obviously your sinker or your ask isn't going to be the same every time either. But they are all going to loop back and connect to what your ask is, what your sinker is. Okay? All right. So I always like to give families a little bit of context for special education because I think it's important to realize how new it is. This country has had common schools or public education really since the very beginning, but we haven't had special education. We only got it as a law passed in 1975. And when that happened, there were children all across the country who were actually excluded completely from school. There is a state that had a law that allowed children to be completely excluded from public education if they had a disability. That state, unfortunately, was Maryland, which is where I live now. But I don't want folks to think that, that was some kind of outlier. Other states had similar laws, particularly in the American South. And then, what state was the first state to have a special education law? That was Massachusetts. I think that's because our friends from Boston were very proud of that fact, and they should be. But, Boston, they get to brag about Massachusetts a little bit. Okay. So in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was enacted. This is the predecessor statute for IDEA. The name changed in one of the reauthorizations, and we'll talk about that. But it was really, the first special education law. It was passed at the end of 1975, became effective in 1977, and didn't get a lot of support from the president during the signing ceremony for the law. This is a law that has always been under siege and under supported. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the big idea, like the premise behind IDEA, was really that all children can learn and that all children are entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, and that there are some safeguards built into the system to protect the rights of students and families to access their right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment appropriate. IDEA is and has always been both a civil rights statute and a funding statute, so it's a little bit different than a lot of laws. And then more recently, with Andrew F., the Supreme Court case, we see that, we see some development in the what FAPE looks like exactly. I've been encouraging folks to, stop saying just FAPE, free appropriate public education, and really remind folks that the Supreme Court said it needs to be a free, appropriately ambitious public education. A free, appropriately ambitious public education. because as folks know from high school government, the court interprets the law, and the interpretation of the word appropriate that the Supreme Court has given us is that it is appropriately ambitious. Okay, and I think that is just so important to remember. All right. So like I said, IDEA is a federal law and it is reauthorized every 5 years. Here are some reauthorizations, and you'll notice that these are not exactly every 5 years. There's some disconnects here. You know, you'll see between 97 and 2004, that's a little more than 5 years. And then there's some amendments that happened quicker. So just be aware that there's no rule that says it actually has to happen every 5 years. It should, but it doesn't always. Okay, and here are some changes that happened over the years. So in 1990, we changed from handicap to using the word disability to come up with, to come into the modern era in terms of language. In the 90s, we added autism and TBI, traumatic brain injury. Also in the 90s, we added mandated transition services for students who are leaving public education and going on to adulthood. We added new related services like assistive technology, rehabilitative counseling in the 80s. Also in 97, we added some language around participation in state and district-wide assessments. For those of us who were around in 97, you might remember that that's also when there was, a big push in the education department generally to do some testing and get data on children. And kind of as part of that movement, we also saw that IDEA was amended to clarify the participation of youth and children with disabilities in district-wide assessments and statewide assessments. Okay. 97, we saw some changes in how discipline happened. 97, we also saw the inclusion of the gen ed teacher in the IEP team, which is just so important. And also in 97, we saw mediation added as a voluntary method. So, changes are possible and changes have happened, and some of them have been very impactful. So just kind of generally at a high level, IDEA serves children from age 0 to 21 or 22, depending on your jurisdiction. Sometimes students can stay until they're 22 to finish out the quarter or the term or the school year that they're in. And it serves students with disabilities, and disability has a specific definition. In IDEA, it has to be one of the 13 disability categories that are outlined in IDEA, and the disability must adversely affect educational performance. Okay. And as a result of that adverse impact, you have to need specialized instruction or special education services. So that's the bare bones of eligibility. And here's our first blue slide. Okay. And this is an opportunity for you to think, maybe make a note or two, think about your experiences and say, okay, well, what is it about eligibility that wasn't great for me? Or do I think there need to be changes? So one space where, parents sometimes have a lot of conversation and struggles is this adverse effect on educational performance. It's not just enough to have the disability. There has to be this, adverse impact. And what does that mean? What does that look like? A lot of parents have questions about the aging out process. There's questions about grade level achievement versus age level achievement. Which one should we be using when we're looking at measuring academic impact? Okay, so again, these blue slides are places for you to think. You are welcome to pause the recording here and write down any notes or thoughts about things that you might want changed, or even places where you ran into problems. And it's okay if you don't have a solution yet, right? It is perfectly okay that you don't have a solution yet. We can talk through that on Wednesday about what might be a good solution or what would work, or, maybe this is a place where further study is warranted. All right. Okay, so evaluations. Evaluations are a core part of special education. Federally, every school district has 60 days to do that evaluation after initial consent. And the school definitely does need the parent consent to do the evaluation. And it triggers a statutory timeline. And then reevaluations and a redetermination of eligibility happen every 3 years. And I think it's so important to talk about this slide, especially for DC families, because for years, DC had the longest timeline for evaluations in the country. And that was 120 days, which, to be honest, was just somewhat shameful. And there was a really concerted push from the advocacy community and the council to get that changed. And it did. It came in line with the rest of the country. And now the district has 60 days to do an evaluation from the initial consent. And I just want to flag this for folks because sometimes when you're in this work, it's hard to see that change is possible. Change is possible. Okay. Going from 120 days to 60 days was huge. Okay. It was huge on paper, but it was also huge for kids at schools. So I just want to remind folks about that. Okay. The other part about evaluations is there are independent evaluations that can be paid for by schools if authorized, and that's at public expense. Families don't have to use an evaluator suggested by the school or chosen by the school. They can use their own outside evaluator. And the school does need to consider the evaluation, but they don't need to accept it. For DC families, I would really recommend you look at some of the resources on AJE's blog about how DCPS considers outside evaluations. It's very useful. I'll drop a link in the comments here for folks so you have ready access to it. Okay. But those evaluations, again, are incredibly important. And that's a space where really for a lot of families, investing in a quality evaluation on the upfront makes a big difference. Right? Because the student, like we mentioned, to be eligible has to have one of the 13 disability categories. And by reason of that, needs specialized instruction, which brings us to a blue slide. What changes based on your experience might you want to see around evaluations? Is 60 days quick enough? What do we mean by consideration? What does that mean? Does the school have to justify any diversions or any, stepping away from recommendations made by an evaluation? What about qualifications? And then what about timeline violations? I know a lot of families have been very frustrated by how long it takes to get an evaluation, and it takes even longer if you have to go through dispute resolution. Should there be a built-in remedy for timeline violations? Again, this is a place for you to sit down, think, write a couple notes, feel free to pause me, and think about what changes you might want to see regarding the evaluation process. Okay. IEP meetings. Oh, fun stuff. So AJE families know that there's a lot in IDEA that happens at an IEP meeting. And like we talked about in the earlier slide about reauthorization, this is where we saw some changes before, right? It used to be the gen ed teacher was not a required member, and now it is. Now they are. So the law has these required members. What do we think? The interpreter of the evaluation results. Well, who is that? What does that mean in your jurisdiction? In DC, it just means someone who's qualified to interpret the evaluations they're going to be talking about. And at the discretion of the parent can invite other individuals, and so can the school district. But are there limits on that? Should there be limits on that? Again, this is a place where we can think about it. Should the student be a required member? We require that they are invited, but they're not required to participate. Okay. Excusal, who doesn't have to be there. So there's really 2 times when someone can be excused from the meeting, and that's when, if we're not going to be talking about their area, which is candidly somewhat uncommon, but does happen, or if they submitted their input in advance and everyone agrees that they don't need to be there. And that's everyone, the parent and the school. Those are really the only times when people can be excused from the meeting. So what changes might you want around the IEP meeting process? You know, one thing that DC families should be very, very proud of is that the same bundle of legislation that reduced the initial evaluation timeline from 120 days to 60 days. We also had some legislation that required that school districts give parents materials 5 days in advance of the meeting, right? That was a big change. Are there other changes like that? I know a lot of families have concerns about the role of the LEA representative because of the district's unique government structure. With, you know, OSSI as the state educational agency, you know, especially around non-public placement. A lot of families want clarity or adjustments to understanding the role of the state education agency or the central office in the IEP meeting process. A lot of families have talked to me about the participation of RSA in these meetings. You know, they are required to be invited, but not required to participate. You know, so this is again a place to stop and think and say, well, what changes would you like to see at reauthorization? Maybe are there people who you don't want to have in the meeting? That's also possible. So again, you don't need to have all the answers today, but just think about what changes might make sense for you with IDEA's reauthorization and what do you want to see there? Okay, so once you've gone through, you know, evaluations and eligibility, and you've had the meeting, you start making that IEP, right? And the IEP requires that there be a statement of present levels, okay? And that present levels include both academic and functional, and that's like, you know, real life stuff. And that should include quantitative, so measurable data, and it's a snapshot, the snapshot of where the child is, you know, and that's the present levels. Sometimes they're called the PLOPs, present levels of performance. It essentially is a baseline snapshot. So here's some examples of present levels that just to point out what works and what doesn't work in this space. You know, we have the first one. Micaiah is a third grade student. She can count 1 to 10 100% of the time. Using touch math, she can add 1-digit numbers without assistance with 90% accuracy. She requires a verbal prompt to complete addition with 2-digit numbers. But with that verbal prompt, she can complete the problem accurately 75% of the time. So that gives us a pretty good picture of where she is academically, right? This second one makes my head want to explode a little bit. Micaiah has a beautiful smile. She is a pleasure to work with. She is a very cute little girl. That is all wonderful, but none of that is quantitative and none of that helps us make a plan for Micaiah's academic achievement. Okay. And that's not consistent with the requirement that there be a baseline, that you have useful information in there. Now it can be a little more difficult to write good present levels around functional skills, but it can be done and it doesn't have to be something like this. It could be in this example, it could be Micaiah struggles with high anxiety situations and is often unable to demonstrate academic skills when she perceives a lot of anxiety or evaluation going on around her. So, you know, maybe you might have some goals around anxiety or test performance, that kind of thing. But that's a skill, right? So that's a little different. Okay. All right. Okay, so the IEP must include a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals. You must be able to count or measure the goal. So it's got to be objective and subjective. not subjective. Okay, so it's got to be objective. You should be able to look at some sort of data and see what we've got there. Okay, it's not subjective. It's not looking at the child saying, are they doing better? That's not objective data. Okay. Right. And your state may have short-term objectives. We have those here in the district, and those are just really the short-term, the steps to achieving the bigger goal, right? The annual goal, and those are just the interim steps along the way. Okay. Here's some more examples of goals. We can talk more about them on Wednesday, but I have concerns with the first one. I like the second one. Little concerned about, whether or not it's accurate, but I like it. I have real concern about Sarah's. I have no idea what sit still means, really, and I don't know what her baseline is. And I like this last one, and I love the fact that it's a grade level passage. That brings me joy, and I love the fact that he's got to do it for 5 consecutive days. Little worried about the passage length. I would like to see some detail about that part. But I like this. It gives me a sense of what we're trying to do and when we're trying to get there. Right. All right. So tracking progress. Again, the IEP has to contain a description of how we're going to find out how these kids are getting to where they're trying to go, right? So what's their progress towards the annual goal? How are we going to measure that? And when are you going to get updates about progress? I think sometimes if you have a question in your head about whether or not, this goal is appropriate, is it objective, is it measurable, is it something I can use? When you start to ask yourself, okay, well, what will my progress reports around this goal look like? That's when it will become obvious to you whether or not it is. Because, for example, just going back for half a second, it's very hard to see what objective data would answer the question, Sarah will sit still, right? Or will learn to read. It's hard to know what the progress reporting would look like for that. But if you have more specific goals, Sarah will reduce her out of chair time by X amount over Y period of time, you'll be able to get a better sense of what progress might look like, and how you want to refine and improve that goal. Okay. All right. Another thing, in addition to specialized instruction and the goals, is the IEP has to include related services. Again, this includes the beginning date and end date, where it's going to be, how often it's going to be, and the duration of those services. So, half an hour, 3 times a week, out of general education, or half an hour once a week in general education. There's lots of different ways services can be delivered, but based on the IEP, you should be able to read it and know. Okay. And in 2004, with the reauthorization there, we saw that instructional methodology can be added to the IEP. This was a big deal, and it was a big change. And it started to tell us how we would do things. So this is where we could see language like, using ABA, informed strategy, student will, whatever the goal is, or using a phonics-based approach, or using the science of reading, or like you saw in the earlier goal, using touch math or touch counting, right? So those are, you can see, that's just an example of an improvement or a change that happened, where before you weren't allowed to include instructional methodologies, or it kind of varied state to state. And now, after 2004, the law is very clear. If the IEP team determines that a specific methodology is needed for FAPE, then instructional methods can be addressed in the IEP. They don't have to be, but they can be. Okay, blue slide, yay. All right, so what changes might folks want? Here's just some starting places. I know in DC, for example, we don't track specialized instruction the way we track related services. That's a big deal for a lot of families because they don't necessarily know what services their child is getting. Um, DC doesn't have a lot of robust guidance to schools around um, a plan to reach grade level for students with disabilities. Other jurisdictions do. For example, Baltimore has a great program called 1 Year Plus, where the IEP team really has to talk about and think about how we're going to get every student to grade level. Is that something parents want to see? Do parents need clarity around the methods in general education? What methods do we want to see used? Is there something in gen ed that can be addressed in the IEP process? I think we talk a lot about sometimes, all of our special education students are general education students first. Well, sometimes that means we might need to talk about general education a little bit more in the IEP. So again, this is a great place to pause, think, get a cup of coffee, and think about what you might want to see. Right, LRE, least restrictive environment. Here's an exact quote from the law: to the maximum extent appropriate. I feel like sometimes people forget the appropriate. Children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are not disabled. And that's really what the LRE is, right? To the maximum extent appropriate, where the child's capable of learning and making good progress. Children should be educated with their non-disabled peers. It's an anti-segregation statute, but it doesn't require necessarily inclusion. I think that's the thing to remember. LRE is an individualized determination. It is not some mandate that we do the same thing for every kid and that everybody be in the same classroom. It is something where we say to the maximum extent appropriate for the student. They be educated with their peers who are not disabled. And here's an example of the LRE continuum. And we see here just kind of all the different places students can be educated. But it's also important to note, and we've seen this definitely since COVID, where does homebound placement fit exactly? Where does community-based placement fit exactly? Where does online instruction fit in the continuum? This is really a moving post-COVID. We really are kind of evolving our understanding of what LRE means. Where does a dedicated aid fit in this? For some students, they experience it as a very segregating, restrictive person and service on the IEP. And for other students, it allows access that, wasn't otherwise possible. So this is just an example of what LRE can look like. And then we have disproportionality. The district's got really good data. Good data in the sense that there's a lot of it. Not good in the sense that it does reveal a tremendous disproportionality in both classification and placement in restrictive settings. But it's an important thing to realize and note and track and talk about in IDEA. And one of the reasons why they track so much of that data is to reveal the fact that we do have some significant disproportionalities in both setting and educational outcomes and type of setting. We also see significant disproportionalities in school discipline rates and how often students are exposed to things like restraint and seclusion and violence at school around disability classification, race and income, and gender. I'll put a link in the comments to it, but OSSI's landscape study is just a great example of why it was so important that we track and get this data so that we could see some of the disproportionalities that are happening in special education. Okay. All right. So placement, again, blue slide, what do parents want to see here? What changes do you think that might need to happen in IDEA to make your experience as a family better and lead to better outcomes? I know in DC, one of the things that I hear people talk a lot about is, the role of the Office of the State Superintendent of Education in the placement process. What do we think of that? Should that be permissible? Should it not be? Should there be limits on that? What do we think of the certificate of approval process? Is that acceptable? Is it okay to limit the number of non-public schools that a student may be able to consider? And then, should there be goals that require, should IEPs include a goal that require a return to LRE? There's a lot of questions to ask here. So just think about it. What are changes you might want to see? What are questions you have? Again, you don't have to come to the meeting on Wednesday knowing the answer. Just come knowing what you want to think about. All right. Transition. This is another place where DC families should be very proud. Transition plan is implemented at age 14. That is the federal law, but like any federal law, right? It provides kind of the minimum that you have to do, but states can do more. DC decided to do more, and transition planning in the district starts at age 14. Really important, right? Should be assessment based. There's been some confusion about that. What does that mean exactly? That might be a place where, again, that might be a good ask for families to think about when they talk about changes. But secondary transition is really just the plan for adulthood, looking at what's independent living, what's your next step going to be. And it should include other agencies. And IDEA does require that in the district, it's RSA, the Voc Rehab Agency, be invited to the meetings. It doesn't require that they attend though. But there are lots of agencies that can participate in secondary transition. In addition to Social Security, vocational rehab, like RSA in the district, there's advocacy groups that can participate, and so can the Centers for Independent Living, and your P&A agency, your Protection and Advocacy Agency in the district, that's Disability Rights DC, formerly known as University Legal Services. So again, this transition part was added to IDEA in one of the reauthorizations, and maybe we need to think about changing it a little bit. So discipline. This is another place where we saw a lot of changes to IDEA. After 10 days of being out of school, either in aggregate, right, or in a row, students are entitled to a manifestation determination review under the federal law. And that should explain, what the student did, what rule they broke, and, what the school is proposing. I think it's important for families to remember that the manifestation determination review is really an anti-discrimination tool to make sure that we're not removing children from schools for behaviors that are related to their disability. One thing that one of the reauthorizations did that was really great is it made it clear that there's a functional behavior assessment, and that should be the basis for any kind of behavior intervention plan that's created for a student, right? We're not just going to make plans based on theories. We're going to make plans based on data, just like the rest of the IEP, it's got to be data-based. Okay. So again, with the MDR, like I mentioned, it's essentially an anti-discrimination statute or process. And it's really designed to allow the IEP team to come together to explore the relationship between the student's disability and the behavior. Okay, because we don't want students to be punished for disability related to their behavior or behavior that manifested because their IEP or behavior intervention plan wasn't being fully implemented. They have to have the MDR whenever there's something that could result in a change in placement. A change in placement is any change in where the child is being educated that is 10 days or more. Okay. There are some exceptions. For example, regardless of the outcome of the MDR. There are some situations where a student can be removed for up to 45 days. That's basically, we call them the big bad ones: guns, drugs, or serious bodily injury. The serious bodily injury definition here borrows from the criminal code, so it's not a boo-boo. It's a serious injury to another person. And this allows a 45-day removal, regardless of whether or not it's related to the student's disability. And that came about from one of the reauthorizations. And we know in DC and just like nationwide, there is a tremendous amount of disparity in discipline. We know that students with disabilities are disciplined more. They're often disciplined more harshly, and they're often far more likely to experience violence at school, either in the form of restraint and seclusion, or just forcible removal from school. Again, OSSE's landscape analysis is a great place to look at some of that data. But just like these things were put into IDEA, right, as part of the reauthorization process, we can make additional changes. So what are changes that parents might want regarding the placement process and the disciplinary process? Regulation of interim alternative educational placements is a big deal, especially as we think about in the district, some of the interesting history we've had around those placements. And we'll include the link in the chat about that for folks who want to learn more. But should there be rules about what an interim alternative educational placement is? Is it okay for schools to have 10 days before they do an MDR? Is that something we want to think about? I just explained that an MDR is essentially an anti-discrimination process. Well, are we okay with letting schools discriminate against students with disabilities for 10 days before we have a conversation about it? That's something that parents can talk about, and that they might want to include in a reauthorization. Access to evidence. This is something that a lot of folks talk to me about. They say my student did this, and they say they have videos, but I'm not allowed to see them. Things like that are things that parents might want to ask for. Okay. All right, dispute resolution. Remember early on, I said that you could now have mediation as an option. Great. What's that look like? So you have a lot of dispute resolution options under IDEA. These come under the procedural safeguards that I mentioned earlier. The procedural safeguards for families and students. And this is really where you start to see that it is both a funding statute and a civil rights statute. Because this is how we resolve complaints. And there's a process for that. There's the state complaint process. There is mediation, and there's a couple different ways to get to mediation in the district. The school can bring an attorney to mediation. The parent can as well. There's a due process hearing, which is a more formal hearing in the district. And it has essentially a mandatory pre-meeting, like a dispute resolution pre-meeting between the parties. And the school can only bring an attorney to that meeting if the parent has an attorney. But if you're a parent who's gone through dispute resolution, any part of dispute resolution, including the facilitated IEP process, mediation, there's some things to think about, and you probably have feelings about your experience. So what changes do you want to see? I know that one thing that I run into a lot right now is the Office of Dispute Resolution is, doesn't have quite the level of staff that some people think they should. And as a result, we can wait a little while to get a hearing or get a meeting or get a mediation. The pool of mediators, so there's a lot to think about there. Parents often struggle to find someone to take their case, and in the district, it's a very formal system that is hard to navigate without an attorney. So, just think about what you've experienced, particularly if you've gone through that process. I have never gone through it as a parent. I've only gone through it as an attorney, and I know that there's a world of difference between those two lenses. So I would really welcome feedback from parents who've gone through it about what might need to change. And if there are changes that we can make at the federal level that would have an impact for families. And then funding, it's the money part. Um, so in 1975, when this law was passed, Congress said the federal government would pick up about 40% of the tab for special education students. They've never gotten there. They've generally paid a little bit less than half of what they're expected to pay. What does that mean? What does that show up like for families? How do they manage to do that? I can't walk out of a restaurant without paying my tab. I don't quite know how Congress has managed to finagle not funding IDEA fully. But that might be a place where families might want to put some advocacy effort into. All right. So we're going to talk just some examples from the 2004 the last IDEA reauthorization in 2004. Start thinking about what changes you might want to be talking about when we reconvene on Wednesday. Okay. All right. So these were some of the changes that happened in 2004. We got the 60-day timeline. We had we had two pilot projects, one around paperwork reduction and one around 3-year IEPs. We saw resolution meetings introduced. States can make those short-term objectives optional. I don't think that's happened in the district. I don't know anywhere where it's happened. But these are some of the changes that happened. Do you have thoughts about that? What do you think is good? What do you think is not so good? And then it was a long process, right? It took quite a while for the 2004 reauthorization to go through Congress. Okay. And then, the regs had to be updated. And then state regulations need to be updated. So this is a slow iterative process, which is part of the reason why we're talking about it now when reauthorization isn't even on the table. Because again, it takes time and we need to be prepared when it does come up. Okay. So the statute, just to give you some context, we've got statutes, regulations, and final regulations. Statutes is the law, right? So IDEA is the statute. Then we have the regulations. Regulations are how we implement laws. Okay. Regulations are how we implement laws. They're kind of the longer explanation for how we're going to go do this thing. Okay. And so when IDEA reauthorization comes up, where we'll be pushing is around, potentially some statutory work, if that's in the cards. But the other place we'll be pushing is in the proposed the regulation rewrite. Now the important thing to remember is that it can't be completely different from the statute. Okay, obviously, because the statute is the thing that the legislature, in this case Congress, created, and the proposed regulations have to be how we implement the statute. So it can't just ignore what the statute says. Okay. And then the final regulation, once the final regulations are in place, those cannot be changed without going through, again, a regulatory change. And that's governed by the Administrative Procedures Act. We are not going to talk about all that today. Okay. The thing I really want folks to remember is that there are statutes and there are regulations, and regulations are the implementation of the statute. And generally speaking, historically, we've put a lot of advocacy effort into making sure the regulations make sense and work. And because that's what people read, that's what states read to understand what they're supposed to be doing. And the statute is the core thing passed by Congress. Okay. And again, that cannot be changed once it's passed, but until it is passed, it can be changed. All right. So, haha, we've made it. All right. So now that you have a sense of what IDEA reauthorization is and what it might look like, let's get ready for Wednesday. So again, on Wednesday, we're going to talk about and think about what this is going to look like, in real life. What are your advocacy asks going to be? What are your concerns? And then we're going to play with this tool, the hook, line, and sinker tool, that can be adopted for a million different purposes, to make your asks to your policymakers and your legislators. Okay. Again, your hook is your introduction, and your connection. Okay, your line is the short version of your story. It does not have to be your whole story, okay? And then your sinker is what we also call your ask, right? And these things are all connected, right? Your hook and your line are always somehow connected to your sinker or your ask. All right, so percolate on all this, okay? I think we feel pretty good. I know here at AJE, we talk a lot about how things show up in DC in particular. We're taking a little step back right now and talking about the federal system writ large. So I'm excited to be doing this training with you all on Wednesday evening. And I'm really excited about getting folks good at the hook, line, and sinker tool, because I think it is just enormously helpful for all kinds of things. So we're going to be together Wednesday evening at 7. You'll get a Zoom link. Again, if you have a friend you would like to have join us, they are more than welcome to do so. You send them this video, and please ask them to do the registration and the pre-survey. All right, call or emails if you've got questions. I'll make sure our information's in the comments again on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Okay. If you have a chance, please do the evaluation survey for HAE. We always welcome and appreciate your feedback. This is a new format for us. This, pre-meeting video and then having the video training in person. I'd love to hear what you think of it. I'm excited. All right. Look forward to talking to folks. Look forward to seeing you Wednesday evening. Check your email for your Zoom link. And again, there's the evaluation survey. And if you need to go back to the beginning to do that pre-survey and the registration form, we would appreciate that. Okay, take care. Have a great week, and I will see you all on Wednesday evening.